Kia ora koutou. He kai mahi aho kei te pokapū matatiki. Go I ora, kei te koa te nā kau ki te korero kia koutou I tenega. So hi, my name's Neil, as Taryn said, and I work here at the Bioethics Centre, and it's a great pleasure, great honour for me actually to be here speaking to you on the subject of health equity and the role of rights. Now, this talk was originally because it's not the right one.
Once you click it once, you can then use the arrow.
Yeah. So this talk was originally, a version of it was originally written for a conference. It was a New Zealand Medico-Legal Congress, and they asked me if I would speak on the question of how well the health service is doing in meeting the demands of equity. And I told them, well, I can't really answer that question, which is after all a kind of empirical question. But I said I can talk in a slightly more abstract way about the notion of health equity and why and how it comes to place demands upon us. And that, broadly speaking, was what I ended up doing. But I suppose in particular, in researching for that talk, I came across some definitions of health equity, which are to be found in the international literature, and which are related to the ethics, public health ethics, if you like. And I found their approach rather interesting. And so kind of what I'm doing here today is riffing a little bit, if I may be allowed to use that musical analogy, riffing a little bit upon their ideas. So there's not much that I would say is very original here, although original to me, because I hadn't come across this literature before. If you have, then I apologize if I'm just really going over stuff you already know. This is the abstract. So this is my introduction. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to try to do. As you can see, there's quite a lot of bits. Hopefully, none of them will last that long, but it is just possible that we won't get to the end. And I shall aim to stop after around about half an hour of speaking and answer any questions or comment or listen to any comments that people either here in the studio may have, or those of you who are out in the rest of the world. So as I said earlier, the primary aim is to understand the moral significance of equity and how rights come in relation to the notion of equity. I shall start by saying a little bit about who I am and where I come from. Then I'm going to have a look at a very well-known equity meme, just as a way of beginning to open up how I'm coming at the subject. And then we shall go on to have a look at the relationship between health equity and health equality, or if you like, between health inequity and health inequality. And then I'll do a bit of a thought experiment, which is the kind of central feature of what I'm doing. And then I shall try to draw, or I shall draw out implications from the thought experiment for health equity and rights. And you may think, well, then he's going to get to his conclusion. But in fact, this is my conclusion. health equity is undermined, where the health of populations is impacted upon by unjust disadvantages related to the determinants of those populations' health. The analysis which I have done and seen suggests that equity and rights are multiply connected to health equity. Constitutively, health equity actually is a human right, at least in a specific definition of health. And associatively or causally, a lack of rights in our social arrangements can lead to inequalities in health, and can indeed, and in that way contribute to making these inequalities not only inequalities, but unjust inequalities or inequities. My thought experiment suggests a couple of things which I find slightly uncomfortable. One, it follows if you moralize equity, that is, if you turn equity into some kind of moral obligation, then the moral obligations of equity and of rights arise where there is a history of unjust interaction between groups, but do not arise where there isn't. So that's a kind of interesting conclusion to arrive at. And it's only a sort of provisional conclusion, because my research in this area is really in a fairly early stage. So first of all, I think it was particularly important at that conference that actually myself and Josie attended, that I said something about who I am, and perhaps it's still, even though people here know who I am, some of you online may not. So I'm a Pākehā. I'm an immigrant from the UK, although I've been here since 1999, but I am English speaking. And in terms of my disciplinary approach, I'm a philosopher by inclination, although not particularly by training. And I work at, or feel at home in, what you might call the analytic tradition of philosophy, which has its roots in ancient Greece, but has modern versions in Western Europe and in the USA and elsewhere in the world. And I suppose I tend to think of an analytic philosopher as being interested particularly in assumptions and presumptions that people are making. But of course, it's not as if they don't make their own assumptions and presumptions, although it certainly doesn't follow that you can't be aware of them. Let me start off by just unpacking this extremely well-known equity meme in order to try to establish what sort of ideas go along with equity, because I think the meme's not too bad once you understand it at helping us with that. So here's this extremely well-known meme that I'm going to attempt to say something about. So first of all, I want to clarify with you that equity is focused on outcome. And you'll notice why I say that is that a couple of things have changed between the left and the right panels, but the main thing that we should focus on in terms of the change is the change from only some people being able to see the match to everybody being able to see it to the same degree. So it's focused on that outcome. Now, it follows from that, at least in this particular case, that equity includes the notion of equality. You'll notice that the panels seem to suggest at first sight as if equality and equity are two different things. But in fact, I think this depends on what you're looking at in the two panels. But if you look in the right-hand panel, which is the one that has the label equity, in fact, what really matters about it is that we have equality of the opportunity to watch the match. So equity, I think, as a moral consideration, focuses on achieving equality where equality matters. You'll also notice that the only equitable distribution of those three blocks is the one that is determined by the equal outcome. So it doesn't, you can distribute those three blocks in all kinds of ways, but only one of those ways ends up allowing everybody to see over the fence. And that's what makes that an equitable distribution, the equality of the outcome. Now, one way in which this meme is not so useful, at least in respect of what I'm going to be talking about, is that equity is, in the approach I'm taking, is going to be population-based. So we're looking at disparities or inequalities between populations. Now, population is a somewhat movable feast, if you like. It can apply to all sorts of groupings, but most obviously here in, say, Aotearoa, New Zealand, it applies to, say, Māori, who are a population who have, when you look at the situation, health inequities. Other populations that this might apply to are Pacifica people, and if we move out into the rest of the world, Black and Hispanic people in the US, for instance, and there are many, many other examples. So I'm going to be thinking populations. This is very individualized, but I'm going to be thinking populations in the rest of this talk. So that's just a summary of what I've just said. But the interesting thing then is what justifies the ethical importance of equality? Why is it so important that we achieve equality? And in particular, how should we think about health equality? What are we getting? What are we actually looking at when we look at health equality? So now I'm going to introduce these definitions of health equity, which are out there, have been developed over the past 30 years or so in the international literature. Goes all the way back to Margaret Whitehead's work in the 1990s. She was an American writer, and she defined health inequities as avoidable, unfair health inequalities. And she defined health equity as the kind of flip side of that, the other side of the coin. Health equity, the absence of socially unjust or unfair health disparities. So I'm going to be working with these ideas and talking in the light of them, really. A decade or so later, Peter, writing in the Journal of Applied Philosophy, contrasted two approaches to inequalities in health, one of which he described as a direct one, but the other one, the one I'm interested in, he described as an indirect approach, where basically what happens is the pursuit of health equity becomes part of a general pursuit of social justice, with the acknowledgement that social injustice is at the heart of health inequity. Now, one thing to note from this is that inequities are inequalities, but of a certain kind. So not just any inequality in some health outcome will do. They are those inequalities that arise from social injustice and unfairness in the account we're looking at. Now, it follows from this, and perhaps we would agree to this even if we weren't starting from this place, that not all health inequalities are health inequities. So, for example, typically around the world, but certainly here in New Zealand, men live on average fewer years than women. But I don't think anybody would say, well, that's inequitable. It's certainly unequal, but it certainly doesn't follow from that it is inequitable, that there is something kind of wrong with the system that produces it. Although that doesn't mean to say you wouldn't try to alter things. It's just the question is, what's the basis for wanting and desiring to do that? I suppose the other thing to note here is that I'm not limiting my notion of equity to the distribution of or access to health resources. And, you know, the primary reason for that is that health resources themselves, important though they are hardly the major determinant of what people's health is. And taking a public health attitude here towards the determinants of health. So now to test and move on from some of these ideas, I'm going to introduce this thought experiment. Now, a thought experiment is the philosopher's kind of experimental side, trying out an idea or testing an idea by putting it out there, imagining, for instance, a situation, often slightly bizarre situation, against which you can test your intuitions about the actual reality that we think we inhabit. So some famous thought experiments. Well, Descartes' famous method of doubt included imagining that all our experiences were kind of put into our heads or into our senses by an evil demon who makes things appear in a certain kind of way, when in reality they may not actually be like that. Of course, Descartes had the idea that maybe experience wasn't the basis of knowledge, and this was one way of trying to test, would we even notice all our experiences have been placed in our heads by an evil demon? Slightly updating that, there's the famous brain in a vat thought experiment, when we are asked to imagine that actually we are not moving around and interacting with each other in some kind of reality at all. We're all brains in vats, which are being fed experiential information as if we were. Again, it's the same sort of idea. And if you're looking for something a little bit more informal, but amazingly similar to the brain in the vat experiment, you can think of the opening position that everybody finds themselves in Matrix, although in that case it's not a brain in the vat, but a body in a sort of toilet. So far as I can see. So thought experiments are there to test reality by imagining something often a little bit bizarre, but quite close to reality. So here's my thought experiment in relation to health equity and health equality. So let's just imagine, always philosophers move to the nearest planet if they're looking for a bit of a test of what's going on this planet. So just imagine that it turns out that there is in fact another planet of humans on Mars. There is a population of humans on Mars. I've no idea how they got there, but what we have to imagine is that there's been absolutely no connection between us and them. So first contact is made between the planets, and a delegation of Earth humans goes to visit the Mars humans. And they find that they really recognize a lot of what they see when they get to Mars. Indeed, quite uncannily like our world, the Earth world. Indeed, the Mars humans themselves are quite unlike your typical alien in the movies these days, who's out either to enslave us or to eat us, or both, I suppose. They actually have very similar moral codes to what we have. And they recognize things like rights, they recognize things like justice, and including within their own society the claims of equity. But there are some notable differences between our social situation and theirs. And the most interesting one from our point of view is that Mars humans live a lot longer and a lot healthier lives than do the Earth humans, what the Earth humans discover. And this isn't explicable by any sort of genetic differences. They appear to be genetically pretty much the same as us. Nor are there natural phenomena that explain it. Their air doesn't start off much cleaner than ours, for example. Moreover, they discover when they're looking at the Mars society, there's actually very little inequality of health within Mars society. Now, when the Mars delegation comes to visit Earth, they really can hardly hide their shock at what they see, because Earth human health is comparatively in a very poor state in comparison to theirs. First of all, they notice that there's huge inequalities between Earth groups, but they also note that the Earth humans, on average and as a whole, or even the best of them, have a much lower average longevity and much lower health than do the Mars humans. Okay, so the question is, do Mars humans in this situation have any duties to the Earth humans that might arise from the claims of equity? And secondly, do Mars humans have any obligations to the Earth humans, again, arising in this case from the rights that Earth humans might claim to have? The answer will be no, both. Just to spoiler alert. Now, why is this? Why is it that, at any rate, as far as my thinking goes, there are no obligations arising from equity and no obligations arising from rights in the thought experiment? Well, the first point I would want to make, and this goes back to the notion of inequity that we're looking at, is the differences are not unjust. There are inequalities, but they're not unjust inequalities. And this is because Mars human society is in no way responsible for the comparative ill health of the Earth human society, and nor is it in any way responsible for the health inequalities among the Earth humans. This is within the context of the thought experiment. Now, contrastingly, if we just turn our attention just to the Earth human side of the equation, we can see immediately that there are multiple unjust relationships which we can see are responsible for the inequalities in health that we find amongst the Earth humans, amongst which might be colonization, marginalization, and all the other sorts of injustices that human populations have visited upon each other through history. Now, Braveman and others, who's a more recent writer, this is 2018, this is Paula Braveman, her group has been working on these ideas for quite some time. And what they do is to really draw out the sort of central issue here, which is when it comes to what determines the low level of health on Earth compared with the Martian or the Mars humans experience, is that really the determinants of health on Earth are very much against higher levels of health overall, and very much against the equality of health amongst humans. And this is because of things such as poverty and discrimination, powerlessness, which characterize the relationships amongst humans. An interesting, so this is just to say, it's just to spell out how these unjust social conditions related to the determinants of health as understood in public health analysis of people, population health. But an interesting additional thing to add here is that unequal health amongst people is a further input into unequal health, if you know what I mean. So it's not all a one-way street between social injustice and health inequity. In health inequality or health inequity, unjust health inequality feeds back into people's ability to take advantage of the world around them, to live their lives the way they would like to, and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of vicious circle going on here, which implies that we could create a virtuous circle if we could make things go back the other way. It certainly, by the way, doesn't imply that doing your best against this kind of social wave of injustice, which is washes over us, is something you shouldn't do. You know, one has to do one's best. But the bigger picture certainly is the one that's going to probably ultimately determine how far you can go. Now, just for a moment, I want to just think a bit about John Rawls. So John Rawls comes up with the notion of justice as fairness. And it certainly has a bit of an equity look about it, because what John Rawls says is that where you have inequality in some specific area, in people's, in the goods that people have access to or actually have, then when you distribute resources, you should do so in such a way that those who have the least access or the most need, sometimes people say, or the fewest valuable things, should receive more of the resources, or at any rate, they should receive the maximum possible benefit in terms of the distribution of resources. So if you go back to the earlier meme, you give 2 boxes to the person who is the shortest, so that they are able to see over the fence, and you give 1 box to the middle person, and you don't give any to the tallest person. The aim here is that your distribution leads to the greatest possible benefit to the worst off, up to the point of lifting them up to equality. But the interesting thing is that Rawls doesn't say that the inequalities which he's trying to put right are in any way the result of injustice. In fact, it may well be the case that they are, because if you imagine yourself behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, which is where this principle gets negotiated, you can imagine that most people are thinking, suppose I was, one of the worst off in society when I get back into the real society. And they're probably conceiving their being worse off in terms that we're all very familiar with, in terms of being oppressed or enslaved or having bad having few opportunities for good work. That's probably what they got in mind. That's certainly what I would have in mind. And, then there's a case for saying, well, in those actual social circumstances, there probably is quite a lot of injustice which has gone into a person ending up at the bottom of the heap. But Rawls himself doesn't really mention this. It's just the amount of need that is out there that he kind of focuses on. So this doesn't seem to fit all that well with my thought experiment, which may be all the worse for my thought experiment. Or just potentially it's something that we could put to Rawls. Actually, he doesn't talk about health himself, but Norman Daniels, who takes the Rawlsian position, does. Now, we do have a few minutes just to think about where rights might fit in here. Now, I'm going to define rights, not define it, but say that, amongst other things, rights refers to a justified demand made by a person, or I suppose I'm thinking of population, of some other group, or maybe we'd say of society as a whole, who then has the obligation or the responsibility to do something about the demand. Now, I don't think this characterizes all rights, but I think anything that it does characterize probably has a good reason to be called a right, a justified demand. For instance, I think we all have a right to self-defense, but I can't imagine that we can oblige anybody to attack us in order that we can exercise our rights. So some rights obviously don't fit into this general, this way of thinking. But if you look at some well-known, well-established rights here in New Zealand, the Patient Rights Code, for example, 10 patient rights, but it starts off by saying these oblige providers to put these rights into operation, which is why when somebody doesn't, there's a problem from in this case, from that sort of legal point of view. Now, Braveman actually characterizes health equity and rights together. So she says health equity is an ethical and human rights principle that motivates people to eliminate health disparities or inequalities. Disparities is the American term. Now, I think there are 2 points in relation to rights which we can try to spell out here. But first of all, I think it's worth just defending a rights approach, because I have myself been somewhat skeptical in the past about rights, and there was a very good, very interesting presentation given right here a few years ago by a colleague of ours, in which he argued that rights are transparent. They themselves are really just a window on an underlying but different moral issue, such as people having a need. And all they really do is enable you to see more clearly that people actually have a need. They don't really add anything to that picture. And if you ask, well, where does the justification come here? Well, it comes entirely from the need. All the right does is kind of cast a bit of light on its existence. But I do think, and this is a kind of initial thought again, that this doesn't quite engage with two ideas. That the first is that it may be the case that the denial of human rights can be seen to play a role in creating the need in the first place. So it's not clear whether need underlies rights, or whether, in some cases, the lack of the denial of rights underlies needs. But also, I do think rights characterize the discussion, the discourse in a certain kind of way, because I think rights come from a place of strength. So you're seeing the person as making a claim for themselves and in the name of their rights, rather than somebody coming along and saying, oh, you poor things, you have needs, we better do something about it if we feel like it. So I think rights do come from a place of strength, and that's actually quite a significant thing. I haven't quite worked out how to put that most effectively, but I do think it's quite a significant thing that rights bring to the picture. That need on itself probably may not. So what I've got two possible relationships between equity and rights. First of all, is that just from a sort of purely legal point of view, or at least an international law point of view, New Zealand and in fact most other countries have signed up to the Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR, and that intends to guarantee everybody the ability to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Notice the highest attainable standard. So not the highest possible standard, but the highest one we can actually achieve. So it's got a sort of practical element to it. And we already said earlier on, not all inequalities are wrong. And this one states that not all inequalities can be fixed, because some people just are bad, and just have bad luck in terms of their health. The other thing is that I think human rights are interwoven with human health, in the sense that if we see inequity as springing from and reflecting social injustice, well, human rights are a bulwark against social injustice. If you can demand your rights from others in terms of, say, full engagement in society and so on and so forth, then that reduces social injustice, and that in turn will reduce unjust health outcomes, inequity, health inequity. Again, though, the thought experiment suggests that actually, much as we might like to think that rights are universal amongst humans, they don't extend to enabling the Earth humans to demand from the Mars humans that they do something to meet the rights of the Earth humans. At least I don't think the thought experiment suggests that, which again may suggest there's something wrong with the thought experiment, or that there's some important difference between the relationship between the Mars humans and Earth humans, and relationships among Earth humans. And it may give me a bit of pause to think, because we often see injustice in the world around us in situations where we don't have any particular ability to do anything much about it. And so I came to the conclusion that maybe what we have here is a case of where we have a second society, be the Martians, who observe rights violations here on Earth, but they have no obligation to do anything about it, or indeed no power to do anything about it. All they can do is encourage the Earth humans to do better. Likewise, international, you might think that's true of states here on Earth, and you might think it's true also of international organizations. What power have they got to alter the behavior of states, other than encouraging them to recognize what they're doing, which is maybe violating rights? Okay, so that brings us back to my conclusion, which we started with, and that's also where I'm going to going to stop now. I apologise, I've gone a bit over time. Fiona.
Thanks, Neil. Very thought-provoking. I went from genetic disabilities to ACC law, all those sorts of things. But let's start with questions from.
Stop sharing and make it.
Sure. Yes. Let's start with questions from the Zoom attendees. Anyone?
Yeah, I've got a question. So you were talking mostly at the start of the presentation about how not all health inequalities are inequities. So I would assume, but by that, what you mean is we don't have obligation to fix every thing that's unequal. What in your mind would classify something as being something that we have an obligation to fix or something that we don't have an obligation to fix? Like why would, so for example, the example you used, I think is a good one of males have a shorter life expectancy than females. So, okay, is that something we have an obligation to fix as a society? And then when you further add, for example, in New Zealand, Māori males have an even higher, even shorter life expectancy. So would that be something that we have an obligation to fix to give Māori males more health? Do you know what I mean? So like, where does that come from?
Yeah, so the question that would be posed by the sort of analysis I'm making is how does it come about that these groups have health inequalities? And in the case of males across New Zealand, the question would be, is there a reason why males live longer, which is somehow the result of unfair arrangements, unjust arrangements in society? And
yeah.
You know, maybe there is, but I haven't seen the analysis that shows that.
Yeah, it's probably due to the testosterone levels more than anything else. But
yeah, and you might say that we don't have an obligation to fix that.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to Māori males, of course, they're in two groups, and people often are in more than one population, but probably the population that matters there, or the one that has the biggest impact, or at any rate fits more clearly with my analysis, or the analysis I'm exploring, is there being a member of the Māori population, which has been unjustly treated over 200 or so years.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of the explanation as to why Māori in general, the population, and then Māori men specifically, have shorter life expectancy. So in that case, if that analysis is correct, then obligations would arise that just because of that unjust history.
So it's sort of they're sort of close to like a natural argument, or like an appeal to nature. Is this found in nature?
No, I don't know. I think people can be naturally different. In fact, you know, it's one of the sort of marks of humankind that they are naturally different to one another. But then the question is, does when it comes to populations, probably the natural differences aren't that great, actually, but just put that aside. When it comes to what's happened to any natural differences there may be, we're looking at the history of the relationship between humans within a natural environment, of course, you can't escape that, but within a social context as well, where different humans have, you know, maybe tried to impose upon other groups their particular view of how they should be and what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And so I would say that probably just unless society has somehow made things worse, then the natural differences are probably those which we don't have an obligation to fix, as opposed to the ones that result from social injustice. Of course, the thing is, I guess by now, and humans have been interacting for thousands of years, it's a bit difficult to tell where the natural ends and where the social begins. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions or comments in the chat about disability. Tui's question very much echoes my own. So, do you want to have a quick read and answer?
Can you read it out? What about
Hillary's? Yeah, that's on. Do you want me to read both of them out?
Yes.
Okay. Hillary says, thanks, Neil. The equality equity meme you showed is still not inclusive of every group, including, for example, disabled people who cannot stand or climb up blocks. It needs to have a further image in the sequence called inclusion or rights, with the fence, i.e. barriers, removed altogether. And to fully embody rights, as in the UNCRPD, there needs to be a lot more access accommodations available to every viewer of the game. Comment on that, Neil?
Well, I do think that actually when I talked about that meme, Hillary and Tui, back in the original conference, one thing I said was that it looks to me as though it does actually take quite a lot from the sort of disability perspective as I understand it, as I've come across it on NEAC, for example, where, you know, there are differences between people. In this case, it's a difference of height in the original meme. But what makes that disabling is the fence, if you like. And you know, if there was no fence, then they'd all be able to see the game, although there might still be a case for enabling the guy, I think it's a guy or the person who's shortest, to be a bit higher up, because it may be more pleasant to watch the game from that. So I think actually that a sort of disability approach where the world does the disabling, and then you have a sort of, there may be, because those height differences could be perfectly natural. And there is an interesting development of the meme, not without the fence, Hillary, although I have seen one without the fence, but a third one where the third person is not, is in a wheelchair, and there's a slope up to the top of the blocks, which means that that person is then able to get up, to step up to the same height, and the disability, if you like, which is not being able to see the game in this particular case, is removed just because you change the environment. I'm reasonably sure, although I haven't done the research, but other people have, that the disabled community in general is worse off in terms of their health outcomes, and that the disabled community that crosses over with the Māori population is similarly worse off, is even worse off, although I don't know that for certain. So yeah, I think that's a significant issue, and you know, it would be nice to remove the fence, and perhaps ultimately that is the aim of equity, is you get rid of the fence, insofar as the fence is the injustice of the social arrangements.
So Tui's comment, a question around disability and moral obligation. If a disability is due to a rare disorder or some other condition which could reasonably be argued not to be due to some form of injustice, then does that mean that no additional rights are conferred to such individuals in the pursuit of equity, if we take the approach you suggest? What's the basis for that argument? And then Tui says, read a fence, there's arguably an opportunity cost in removing the metaphorical fence. If we say that everyone is fine with the fence except the person with the disability, not caused by some injustice, then why would we have a moral obligation to remove the fence under this conceptualization of equity and related rights?
Yeah, so I think my thinking says in early stage, I think there are some problems with this analysis, with a sort of what you might call a strong moral analysis of health inequities as being the ones, or health inequalities being inequities if they spring from social injustice. So, and one of the problems is that it's exactly that one that you seem to be pointing out. And it may be that this particular analysis kind of works in a lot of cases, but then there are significant, important cases where it doesn't work. And that would be a limit on the analysis. And the thought experiment, which might back the analysis up, or at least might be said to try to spell out the implications of the analysis, might here make us wonder whether it is in fact the right analysis, or whether it's missing. What is it in the thought experiments that's missing that might explain why we have, where we is some unspecified social group, maybe society as a whole, to others, when, you know, their situation is, you might say, caused by a natural event. So I do think there's a possible limit here. And yeah, so I would just have to acknowledge that it struck me several times as I was trying to think this through as to what one should say about that situation. And I'd have to think a little bit more about it, I think, before I could make any sensible response.
There's some comments there on your thoughts, but we've got a raft of questions, so we'll get to Josie's.
Neil, thank you. Second time I'm hearing it, so I'm had that advantage of thinking about it twice. I feel like a challenge for me with the definition of health inequity is the causal story that it seems to be relying on. So it relies on the causal story related to past injustice, like past, where I feel that there could be a more complex, so an unjust inequality might have a forward-looking causal story, if you like. So a backward-looking one would say this was caused by things, you know, racism, colonialism, sexism, misogyny, you know, you name it. But here's another forward-looking one that might help with some of the kind of genetic disability, which is that we didn't cause this socially, but we're not going to look at it. We're refusing to put the benefit of our, you know, science to work on it. So, for instance, it may not currently be an inequality, a health inequity that is unjust, unjust health. It may not be unjust that women live longer than men, but if we actually knew why, and there was an intervention that we could do, but like just something that people could eat differently later in life, but we didn't tell anyone about it, then that would be, I think, unjust to withhold that knowledge. And then I just want to make another comment that I think is connected. So there's a version of the story about where human rights come from that isn't about need but it's about dignity and the recognition of humanity and others, right? And so actually, I feel that you could say, well, that the Mars humans, once they come here and see us, immediately do have obligations based in the shared humanness.
Yeah.
You know, some people who want to talk about animal rights would also then go, right, so shared creatureliness or whatever, but we could stop at humans in your thought experiment. And if they knew what to do, then actually that would be one of those kind of causally forward-looking things where you withheld this, and it would be a wrong, and it would be an inequality that that was now suddenly immediately unjust. So can you think about
so I can comment on both of those, although not necessarily. So with the second one, the question would be, whether the Mars human have any obligations with respect to the way we have handled our own dignity. And my view is that they don't. And so far, I haven't seen the problem with the analysis that says that they do. And that's not to say they wouldn't be concerned. Right? They might be concerned a bit like the United Nations is concerned when it sees an injustice, a clear injustice taking place within a state, but where it just has, well, in that case, it has no power. You might say all the marshals have the power, but so that one, I'm not convinced that there's anything wrong. I just don't think they have those obligations. Now, of course, it might depend on what you mean by shared humanness here. You know, what's the story? And all I said was, oh, well, they just turn out to be human, and there is really no shared story. But, you know, it's worth thinking about. The other one I had, sort of before coming on, I was thinking about, you know, what can we do now? What might we do now that would appear like an injustice to the future? And, you know, I think the example you've given where, you know how to do something, but you completely fail to do it, is an interesting possibility. So you know, the approach here is very backward looking. It's trying to put right what's happened, but are we still doing stuff that is going to appear like an injustice? We could have done it, but we just decided not to. Now, what that raises is a really interesting question about the extent to which injustice involves failing to provide high-level health care or, you know, for future generations. I think that's really interesting, and I can think of several situations where it might apply right here in Dunedin at the moment, where something similar might apply. So I think it's that's really interesting point.
It's up to time. I know. So we'll end the formal part. So if anyone needs to get away, feel free to do so. There are still questions. So we can, those who want to.
I'm happy to talk.
Can stay
Well,
around.
I'm particularly happy to hear your questions. Thank you so much for your participation and
Thank you,
attendance.
Oh, Grant's got a question. So you've got Janine.
And Elizabeth has.
And there's lots of chairs.
Yeah, you go for it.
Well, my only suggestion was that what you might be scooting past here is the kind of moral obligation that derives from the virtue orientation of empathy. That we might stress empathy, practicable when possible, as the moral basis of doing what we can to help. And the real risk is when we other the other to the point where we no longer feel empathy, as in racism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'd want, yes, so again, I'm slightly hesitant to accept the virtues account here. Because I wonder what sense would it make to say to somebody you're obliged to be empathetic.
Well, I won't answer that question because of Anscombe's word, you've got a corrupt mind.
Yeah, but the problem, yeah, that's what Anscombe says, and the problem is, has she made a mistake? Now, for instance, I remember the Health and Disability Commission arguing that we should have an 11th right, the right to compassion.
Yeah.
And to me, this just doesn't make any sense. How can you have rights to other people's having certain feelings? To me, it doesn't make any sense. That's not to say there isn't something that emerges out of these thoughts. And after all, Aristotle was the person who came up with some of our original ideas about equity. So perhaps there are some important connections there.
Elizabeth, the question.
Thanks, Taran, and thanks, Neil, for staying on. I've got lots of questions, so I'm going to have to choose which ones to prioritise.
Some separate ones.
So I think one thing that I worry about when embracing this quite strong connection between equity and human rights is invoking that right to the highest attainable standard of health. Seems to me to create more problems for health equity because there are lots of things that would be really good for our health that we cannot provide for reasons that also relate to justice. So, for example, in New Zealand, there are lots of very expensive cancer drugs that we don't provide through publicly funded healthcare, because to do so would drain our resources and mean that we couldn't provide lots of other really important healthcare. So in a sense, by not paying for those things, it could be argued that people who can't afford to pay for them privately are being denied achievement of their right to the highest attainable standard of healthcare. And so therefore they have an equity case for having access to those medications. And because if their right is not being met, they have a claim of justice. So that raises real concerns for me about what that means in the context of equity, because to me, that's not necessarily a question of justice, that people don't have access to those drugs, because not paying for the drugs is also achieving certain aims of justice. So that's one concern about embracing that definition of the right to health. And the other question is just, how do we know when we've achieved equity? How do we know when we've achieved health equity?
Okay, just on the first one, I don't think this analysis necessarily helps us when it comes to prioritizing. So in the case you've given, we are going to have to do some trading. And in fact, that was the point that Tui made earlier on. And what kind of trades are acceptable and what are not. But I think the fact that you can't do something as things stand necessarily shows that somehow you can't recognize that the doing of it would be the right thing if only you could. So I'm not sure. It sounds as if we're being presented with a position where I'm not sure this is what you mean, but I'm kind of hearing, oh, well, if you can't meet somebody's equity goals or needs or whatever, or their rights. Therefore, you have decided they don't have those. And I don't know how that follows.
I'm not convinced that not providing those means your rights have not been met. So I don't think you have a right claim to those things. I think that's the concern I have with the highest attainable standard.
Oh, right.
Is that it seems to me to mean that you have a claim to all manner of things that really you may not have a claim of justice to.
Yeah, so the question is, what are you doing with the term attainable there?
Yeah, exactly. That's the key. That's clearly the key term. Yeah.
So if attainable means attainable, if only you had all the money in the world and all the resources in the world, then, you know, a kind of idealized health position that you might imagine in a thought experiment. It's not clear how far that feeds back into the situation. I think it's interesting that, you know, so I have a feeling, I mean, it's a great point. I have a feeling that attainability is not separate from what society can manage, but it's obviously a difficult relationship, isn't it? Because you could say, and people have said, in relation to inequality here in New Zealand, oh well, we can't do that, you know, and therefore they don't have, you know, this group probably don't have the right. Now, I don't agree with that, but obviously, yeah, you're quite right. There's a lot that hangs on how you're going to define attainability, the relationship between that and possibility. You can hardly demand that people do things that it's not possible to do, but then the question is, what is not possible?
What's possible? Yeah.
Which is
Thanks,
where
Neil.
I thought that it was the word obligation too, and maybe Elizabeth, this gets to you, when you say that there's an obligation, that is a different, of course, a different standard. But when you're given obligation, then you may be like a seesaw, like if you, with Elizabeth's example, that if there's an obligation to provide an expensive cancer treatment, then what other group gets disobliged? So I think that the word obligation needs to be narrow, and that Grant's point about it's different to be obliged to something than it would be good or virtuous to do something, that there's a separate standard there. And if you make obliged too big, then you can unwittingly cause harm by disadvantaging, you know, the people who don't have cancer in this example.
Yeah, so again, the question is really what follows from the fact that you are not able to do two things. Does it follow you don't have an obligation to do them both? And to me, that just simply doesn't follow. And there are some cases where you cannot help but fail to meet your obligations. And I mean, if you kind of deliberately and systematically fail to meet your obligations, despite recognizing, or even start to doubt whether you have them, that's when I would begin to get worried about what society is up to, and that's a bit the picture we have from the past, although perhaps without clear recognition of past obligations. Maybe they weren't as clear for people then as they are today. Although that could be wrong too. Depends. You'd have to go and look at the history of what people actually said. And they said some pretty horrific things in the past. So
Alrighty. Any final? No, thanks, Neil.
thank you.
See you later.
Thanks, Neil.
Do you know what's on next week, Elizabeth?
It's
It's Ben Gray,
Ben
I
Gray.
think.
That's
Yeah.
right, yes.
Yeah, talking about
consent.
yeah, exactly. Thanks, Neil.
Post it, but I forgot to mention that earlier on.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray.
Thanks, Taran, very much.
No worries.
You might want to
Thank you.
stop recording, but then just
Thanks,
check
Neil.
questions
That
out.
was good.
Oh, does it not record the chat questions?
No, but so if you stop the recording, I can't. But just so that there might be questions.